The depth of Total War games knows no bounds. There are many secret and hidden mechanics that most of us would never know about. Until now. I'll be divulging 5 hidden mechanics in Total War, some of which could make a big difference to how you play the game. You may have seen some of my secret stat videos already. If you haven't, I'll link them at the end if you're interested in more of this stuff. For now though, let's get on with it. So the first one, the melee defense penalty when attacked in the sides or back. When an individual entity gets attacked from anywhere but the front, it won't get its full melee defense. And for those who don't know what melee defense is, it's the stat that determines a unit's chance of dodging enemy incoming attacks. The higher this number is, the more they'll be able to dodge and thus the less damage they'll take, helping them survive for longer. Now if we take the Empire Captain here, he has 40 melee defense, which for a hero is pretty good but not fantastic, so he can stay alive relatively well when making use of his full 40 melee defense, which he can only do from the front. If you attack an Empire Captain from either the left or right side, he will have 40% less melee defense than his full amount. In this case, that'll put him down to 24 melee defense. So if an enemy comes in and launches an attack at his side, they'll have a better chance of hitting him than if they did it from the front. And it gets worse for the Empire Captain. If he gets attacked from behind, he'll have minus 70% of his full melee defense amount, which is pretty freaking huge. This puts him down to only 12 melee defense when attacked from behind, which obviously means he's going to have a very slim chance of dodging any of those rear attacks. So if you want to visualize it, it could look something like this. And this is the same for every single unit in the game, whether they're a lord, a hero, an infantry, a cavalry, a monster, they all work like this. Full melee defense from the front, 40% less from the sides, 70% less from the back. And this is applied at the entity level, the individual little model and what's happening to it. So even with a unit of demigryphs, every single one of those demigryph models will have full melee defense from the front, 40% less from the side, and 70% less from the rear. So each individual model's melee defense will react differently depending on where the attack on them comes from. But the real danger of this mechanic is actually for those single characters, the lords, heroes, and monsters, because their animations have a tendency to dive them into the middle of units. Then they end up surrounded, which means any attacks that come in from the back or sides will have a greater chance of landing. Take this dragon for example. Currently it's only fighting things in front of it, but uh-oh, here comes some spearmen behind it, and here it goes diving into a crowd. Now it's going to take all sorts of skeleton attacks from the back and sides with reduced melee defense. This is why it can be particularly dangerous to charge your lords, heroes or monsters into crowds and just leave them there, especially if they're fighting a strong unit because they'll have so much less melee defense. This penalty can also be a worry when rear charged as well. If cavalry comes up behind infantry, smashes it in the back with some hammer and anvil, any individual model that has its back turned and gets hit in the back will have that 70% less melee defense, so probably will be taking a hit from that charge, which will be getting charge bonus damage as well. So yeah, a recipe for taking a hell of a lot of damage very quickly on the charge. When a unit has been flanked though, the models will start to turn around to face their attackers, getting their full melee defense back. So it's only on the initial impact of a charge that this is really a worry. So be sure to watch your lords, heroes and monsters' backs, lest they take a lot of damage very quickly, especially if you get flanked by a couple of characters, one attacking you from the front to distract you and the other one comes up behind you. That could mean a lot of damage very quickly for that character from behind, so worthwhile knowing to help keep your single entities safe. And also be wary of your single entities diving into crowds. If you've got a Terrorgeist that dives into some Blackguard of Naggarond, it's probably going to get surrounded and stabbed up very quickly with its lack of melee defense from the back or sides. Next, the Charge Pursuit bonus. Extra damage that's caused when chasing down fleeing enemies, specifically fleeing enemies, those that are broken or shattered. When you break a unit's leadership and it runs away from the battle temporarily, you can either opt to chase it down or to not and let it potentially come back. If you do decide to chase it down, you'll be getting the Charge Pursuit modifier. This bonus gives your pursuing unit 100% of their charge bonus on every single one of their melee attacks, the whole time they're chasing them down. If you don't know how the charge bonus works, the charge bonus number or stat will add on weapon strength and melee attack to the charging unit on the impact of their charge, and it will last 13 seconds, degrading by 7.7% every 1 second until it runs out. So that's a normal charge bonus, but in this charge pursuit situation we get that full 100% charge bonus amount for every attack that's launched against a fleeing unit. Not to mention you'll probably be attacking them in the back or sides, so there's that reduced melee defense penalty there as well, so tons of damage to be done. And you can see missed opportunities all the time, like here, these spearmen running away in the background, they still got lots of health, they're going to come back. These Chaos Marauders stood here, should have chased after them and smashed them in the back and prevented them from returning. Of course, you do need to check the speed of your pursuing units to make sure they can catch them. This is why cavalry and things like warhounds can be incredibly powerful when chasing down fleeing units, especially cavalry as they have such huge charge bonuses. Warhounds only have a small charge bonus, but they're so fast and can be incredibly cost effective. They can munch off thousands of hit points of fleeing enemies at no risk to themselves because fleeing enemies don't fight back. So 400 or 500 gold for a cheap fast unit like warhounds can be incredibly good value for money. Skirmish Cab can also be good for this. Even mounted yeomen for Bretonia can do the job. If you put them in melee mode and have them chase something that's fleeing away, that's a lot of extra damage they could do at no risk to themselves. So realise the power you have in units with massive charge bonuses and how effective they can be at chasing down and doing extra damage to fleeing units. It can be the key to getting some powerful units off the battlefield early. If you can break a unit's leadership and get it fleeing when it's got half health or maybe even 3/4 health, and you can keep pursuing it and doing that damage, that is an absolute destruction of that unit and a huge waste of money for your opponent. So be sure to realise the power of the charge pursuit bonus. Next to fatigue and the penalties that it brings and what effect that has on your unit's performance. When a unit's been fighting for a long time, it will inevitably get tired. So what happens to them? Well, as you may or may not know, units can go through 6 stages of fatigue. Fresh, active, winded, tired, very tired, ending up at the worst stage of fatigue, exhausted. Units get tired from 2 main factors, running and fighting. They can further be affected by elevation. If the unit is running up a hill, for example, they'll get more tired than if they're running on a flat. And a steep hill can be more tiring than a shallow hill. Units can recover fatigue by standing still or walking. So what are the effects on our units when they reach the exhausted state? Well, here it is. 25% less armor, 15% less speed, 30% less melee attack, 10% less melee defense, 10% less armor piercing melee damage, 30% less charge bonus, and 35% less reload rate. So when your unit is fresh, you won't see any of these penalties at all, but as they start to get more and more tired and move through the stages, you'll start to get these penalties applied all the way up to this, the maximum amounts at the exhausted state. So as you can see, there are some pretty substantial penalties here. If a unit has 100 armor, once it's exhausted it only has 75% armor. If they had 40 armor, they'll only have 30 armor when exhausted. The ability to do damage gets hindered quite a lot. A lot of melee attack is lost, a lot of charge bonus, the armor piercing melee damage as well. And of course, the higher the stat for the unit, the bigger an effect it has. So again, if a unit has 100 armor and loses 25% of it, that's 25 armor points that are gone. If the unit only has 40 armor, it only loses 10 points of armor. So it's less of an effect, but interesting to think about what units it would greatly affect based on what their strength and role is. So while fatigue is natural and is going to happen in the battle, it's not something we need to worry too much about. It's going to happen, it's fine. Don't need to really think about it too much. However, there are a few things that we can do to help ourselves out and to give ourselves that little advantage of maybe keeping our units fresher for longer. The first way is quite simple. Stop running up hills. This can cost you up to 150% more of your fatigue, depending on the steepness of the hill, than if you were running on a flat. So try to walk where possible. The only time you really want to run up a hill maybe is if you're being absolutely hammered by artillery and missiles and you're taking tons of damage. Otherwise, walking is absolutely fine and there's no reason to rush. It does raise the interesting question though of should you walk up the hill and just take artillery fire, suffering more direct damage but less fatigue, or should you rush up the hill, take less damage but take more fatigue for the entire army? Might be another question for another day. And this all connects to one of the most powerful attributes in the game, Perfect Vigor, which means a unit will never suffer any kind of fatigue penalty, as you can see on the Grail Knights here. So they can keep fighting for 10 minutes straight in a battle and they'll still be fresh the whole time. They can run up the steepest hill and still be fresh at the top, never suffering any of those fatigue penalties. And there are some spells and abilities that can have a similar effect. Take these questing knights here, they don't have perfect vigor, they are very tired right now. But bring in a regrowth and it'll not only heal them up, but also restore their vigor 100%, so they'll be completely fresh again, even after the spell has timed out. So as you can imagine, regrowth can be very powerful if used on a strong unit in the late game. It'll take away their penalties and bring them back to full fighting strength, maybe giving them enough push to help win the battle for you. So don't underestimate the power of perfect vigor and any ability that can take away the fatigue penalties. Other than that, the simplest way to get rid of fatigue penalties is just to stand a unit still. It's the quickest way to bring it back to fresh without using spells or abilities. Walking on flatland does also recover it, but very incredibly slowly, so better off just standing still. Although it does take approximately 3 minutes of standing still to recover an exhausted unit back to fresh. Whether that's a good idea or not to leave a unit out of combat that long is really going to be a judgment call for the moment. So consider your fatigue and whether you're wasting it. Do you need to sprint halfway across the map right at the start of the battle? Probably not, unless you're under some heavy artillery fire. Otherwise you can probably just walk and save your boys the fatigue. Now for some sneaky stats with the hiding scalar. Hidden spotting distances. How close do you have to be to a unit that's hidden to spot it? Well, first we have to understand the different types of hiding. There's hiding in the forest, stalk, and unspottable. For the most part, hide in the forest and stalk are basically the same. Most units have hide in the forest and can do so, but only special units have stalk and can hide anywhere on the map, even in the open. And then you have unspottable, which does exactly as it sounds. You can't be spotted until you are very close. So what are the numbers of these spotting distances for the different kinds of hiding? Well, here we've got a puny human man who has a regular spotting distance like most units in the game. He's being approached by some Way Watchers who have stalk until now, where they are just spotted. This is the distance that stalking units will be spotted out in the open. That number is 80 meters. So until you get too close, you won't be spotted until you hit that 80 meter mark and give yourself away. Although for Way Watchers, if they shoot things first, they will be discovered from that. If a unit is hiding in the forest, and this goes for any unit that can hide in the forest, whether they've got stalk or not, it'll be 60 meters is the spotting distance. So you can be a little bit closer to units before they find you when hidden in the forest. Now, there are some exceptions, and of course one of them is gobos. Night goblins have stalk, and they can get 20% closer to the enemy than most other units, bringing them to about 64 meters before they get spotted. That little bit of extra time could allow for some extra sneaky stabbing. And can you guess which other faction gets 20% better hiding than most? That's right, it's those damn dirty rats. They'll have that slightly better spotting distance too, allowing them to get a little bit closer before they're found out. But naturally, Skaven are Skaven, and they're the best at being sneaky backstabbers, so they can go one up on everyone else with concealment bombs. These give you the unspottable trait, which reduce the spotting distance to 20 meters, which is basically right on top of your enemies. Pretty brutal if you time it all well. But alas, the trees can be pretty scary too. Tree units for the wood elves like dryads, treekin, and treemen have the best spotting distance in the game at only 30 meters. Obviously, that's not as good as concealment bombs at 20 meters, but those are an ability that can only be used a few times. Dryads are always hidden in the forest at more than 30 meters. Pretty terrifying if you are fighting the wood elves in the forest and then a ton of trees appear on top of you trying to smash your skull off. You can see here, this is the 30 meter distance, so very close, not a lot of time to react if a bunch of trees should appear out of the trees. But hold up, there is one faction that gives zero shits about any trees or hidden units. It's the Lizard Boys and their predatory senses, a trait that's held by a lot of units in their army. This allows them to discover any hidden units way sooner than any other faction. The only exception is unspottable units that even lizards can't uncover. Here's these Way Watchers, and you can see they've been discovered already. This is way sooner than the Empire Lord that I showed you just now. This is because units with predatory senses get the spotting distance of 160 meters. Whether a unit is in the open or in the forest, it's all 160 meters. So good luck trying to hide from the lizards. Now, if you'd like an in-game point of reference, because it can be difficult trying to imagine 80 meters, you can use your Lord's Aura, which is 70 meters. So it's just a little bit further than that. Or a little bit shorter at 60 meters if you're in the forest. This can just be handy to gauge to know how close you can get with your hidden stalking or forest hidden units. This can be useful to remember so that you don't pull your units too far out of the way, perhaps more than is necessary. Because of course the further a unit is away, the longer it takes to get into battle. And of course you can divide this 70 meter aura up a little bit smaller, here's 60, here's 30, so you can get an idea of some distances and where you might need to be if you want to try and move a sneaky hidden unit. So be aware of your distances, not only to know how close you can get with your hidden units, but also what the enemy may be trying to do to you with their hidden advantages. And just remember that if you do have hidden advantages, they probably won't work against the lizardmen. And lastly, elevation and high ground. It's just like Obi-Wan taught us. If you've got the high ground, your enemy can't win. Okay, maybe it's not just like Obi-Wan taught us, but you'll at least have an advantage taking the high ground. Now, there are obvious advantages, like the enemy has to run up a hill, so that's going to take them longer and make them use more fatigue trying to get to you. Not to mention it's harder for them to flank you because of the slower movement. But oh boy, is there some hidden advantages to be had here. Starting with melee. When two units are fighting and one is elevated above the other, the unit fighting downhill can do up to 30% more damage. Up to being the important word there. And they will take 30% less damage from the unit fighting uphill. So some pretty significant advantages being somewhat elevated above your opponent. The difference in damage is determined by how elevated the unit is above the other, up to a difference of 1 meter. So you can see the pretty hefty advantages from having the high ground. Even if it's only a small shallow slope, it's still something. And while of course running up hills will slow you down and cost you more fatigue, it'll also affect your charge damage because you're moving slower. So when you charge uphill, you'll be doing less damage than if you were on a flat. But it works both ways. While you run uphill slower, you will run down it faster, which means more potential damage for your charges. Because of the way collisions are calculated, more speed means more damage basically, so the faster you can get your units traveling, the more damage they're going to do. So this could be pretty significant for those heavy cavs with lots of charge bonus or chariots. Charging downhill into things just gives them that slight bit of extra damage, which of course is always going to help with your ultimate goal of murdering your enemies. So for any kind of melee unit, fighting downhill is a big advantage if you can find the opportunity to do it. And guess what? Missile units also have similar advantages. Missile units elevated above their enemies firing downhill will do up to 30% more damage, and also take 30% less damage from any missile that's fired uphill towards them. And the difference in damage is determined by how high the elevated unit is above the lower one, up to a difference of 40 meters, rather than just 1 meter for the melee difference. This is why missile units on walls in sieges can be very powerful, because they're elevated so much higher than their opponent shooting down on them, and also gain the defensive advantages as well. So be sure to remember what Obi-Wan taught you. The high ground is very important. This information also shows you how powerful the Strider perk can be, as it eliminates any combat or speed penalties when moving around difficult terrain. Pretty powerful in the right situation. So there you go, 5 sneaky hidden mechanics in Total War that you probably maybe didn't know about. Hopefully this has been useful and you'll find some way to use this information in battle. Do check out these videos as well if you want more hidden stuff. Thanks for watching, I hope you've enjoyed this. I will see you in thine future.